A sea of frothing waves crashes against rugged shoreline. A lone Spanish flag flutters in wind that whispers of empire and of an undying claim. Here, on the sands of Florida, a settlement is born, a place where the old world meets the new, where ambition writes its name in soil. This is not a colony long forgotten. It is the first enduring footprint of Europe in what would become the United States. Welcome to the beginning of St. Augustine. Arrival on the shores of La Florida. In September of 1565, the Spanish admiral Pedro Menéndez de Avilés landed his fleet far from the comfort of home. He had sailed into unknown waters of what the Spaniards called La Florida, seeking to plant a permanent flag, to carve a foothold for the crown. The land was wild, full of tall pines, coastal marshes, salt air, and the presence of native peoples who had lived here for generations. The Timucua village of Salois sat near the inlet. The waterway held promise and danger in equal measure. In those early hours and days, the foundation was laid, not just of a settlement, but of a story of survival and transformation. The oldest European-founded city in what would become the United States was born, a city built not by accident, but by a clear, resolute will. And in its birth lie the themes of what the coming centuries would carry: contact, conflict, identity, and change. As we stand on that shore, looking at the tiny camp among swamps and trees, we sense the weight of that moment, the first ripple in a tide of history. Confrontation and claim, Spanish versus French. The year is 1565. Pedro Menéndez de Avilés sails into the waters of La Florida under the banner of St. Augustine. The land is inhabited by the Timucua people. Native villages dot the shoreline and forests. Menéndez arrives with a clear mission: to establish a permanent foothold for Spain, to secure this coastline, and to remove rival claims. He quickly moves against the Fort Caroline, a French Huguenot settlement just north, whose very presence threatens Spanish ambitions. In September, within weeks of landing, Menéndez's forces march north, engage, and destroy Fort Caroline in a violent confrontation. The French presence is eliminated. The message: the Spanish possession is final. The stake is set. The act is more than military, it is symbolic. Spain's crown watches, the French recede. The native villages observe foreign powers clashing on their shores. Menéndez plants the flag. He names the settlement San Agustin, because the ships first sighted land on the feast day of the saint. The moment is heavy with meaning. A European empire claims new soil. Yet the encounter opens questions. The native peoples, Timucua and others, must decide whether to resist or ally. The French defeat echoes through the region, and the settlement, weak and vulnerable, must stand against storms, hunger, the unknown. Here in the marshes and maritime winds of Florida, Europe's wars and dreams are transplanted into new soil. The conquest is ongoing, but the foundation is laid. Spain means to stay. And so begins a chapter of endurance. Founding walls and first alliances. The sun rose over a rugged coastline as a handful of Spanish men, women, and children disembarked at the mouth of the bay. They came with shovels, saws, and the weight of a kingdom's ambition on their shoulders. In September 1565, they began building the walls of a settlement destined to stand. They named the place St. Augustine, Florida, or San Agustin, in honor of the feast day on which they sighted land. They did not arrive in isolation. Nearby indigenous villages of the Timucua people bore witness. These native faces watched the newcomers stake a claim, dig trenches, and raise timber palisades. The Spanish recognized the need for alliances. Chief Siloy of the Timucua would sign agreements, share water rights, guide the newcomers through unfamiliar terrain. Supplies arrived slowly from Spain. Harvests failed in poor soil. Storms threatened ships. Their task was enormous: dig wells, plant crops, build a church, and set the tone of permanence. The Spanish sought not only to defend against rivals, the French, the English, but also to transform the land and its people under the banner of the Spanish crown and the Catholic faith. Inside the still-standing streets of Old Town, their original grid plan echoes this early layout. Narrow lanes, shaded courtyards, walls built against both nature and time. That alignment was more than architecture. It was intention. It said, "We are here. We will endure." However, the alliances with the Timucua were delicate. Cultural misunderstandings, disease, pressure on native resources, all these threats undercut the effort. The Spanish learned rapidly. Survival depended as much on diplomacy as on fortification. In these first years, the settlement faced swampy lands, heat, mosquitoes, storms off the Atlantic, supply ships delayed, morale fluctuating. Yet they pressed on. Every log hewn, every adobe wall raised, became an act of defiance against the sea and distance and uncertainty. From these efforts emerged a place where Europe's ambition met America's wildness. And as those walls took shape, the story of St. Augustine shifted. From landing to settlement, from expedition to habitation. Ahead lay centuries of change, but this moment, this posture, defined everything to come. Living on the edge, survival by the shore. The settlement of St. Augustine, Florida, was more than a banner and a claim. It was an experiment in endurance. The Spanish built raw shelters of wood and thatch, planted gardens in inhospitable soil, and drilled wells in sandy terrain. The marsh air, the mosquitoes, the Atlantic storms, all pressed in. Supplies from Spain arrived only occasionally. The settlers had to learn the land and the people around them quickly. They turned to the native Timucua people for knowledge of local foodways, fish, shellfish, wild plants, and for protection in a land still contested by rival European powers. The Spanish church and garrison rose near the village of Siloy, yet the relationship was fragile. The Timucua had their own lands, traditions, and grievances. Disease, cultural clashes, resource strain, each threatened the fragile new town. And then there were the storms. In August and September, Atlantic squalls roared in. Ships anchored in the inlet were battered. The settlement's position by the sea was a blessing and a danger. In 1565, the French settlement at nearby Fort Caroline suffered under a hurricane, leaving the Spanish a chance and a warning. Slow rebuilding followed. Every plank and every nail in St. Augustine bore the smell of salt, sweat, and risk. In this time and place, the true character of the settlement emerged, not as an instant success, but as a stubborn outpost, one built on compromise, diplomacy, sinew, and resolve. The walls might have been simple, but the intent was strong, to stay, to last. From the high winds to the murmuring marshes, from the quiet diplomacy to the loud threats of nature, St. Augustine survived where others failed. And in that survival, we see how permanence begins, not with triumph, but with persistence.
Fortress by the sea, defending Spanish Florida.
As decades passed, the settlement at St. Augustine, Florida, grew, not just in homes and walls, but in purpose. What began as a small Spanish outpost evolved into the military and administrative heart of Spain's holdings in La Florida. From its vantage on the inlet and bay, the town became a fortress and a symbol. Spain fortified the coast to defend against rivals, French, English, and to protect its treasure fleets sailing the Atlantic. The construction of ramparts and stone walls changed the settlement's face. Soldiers drilled, guns were mounted, sentries kept watch over marsh and sea. Through storms and skirmishes, the outpost endured. Even when English privateers struck or native resistance flared, St. Augustine weathered the pressure. Within those walls lay not only Spanish ambition, but a complex interplay of cultures, indigenous peoples, African-descended residents, and Spanish colonists, all meeting at this frontier. But with protection came responsibility and strain. Defense cost money and manpower. The climate, the marshes, the supply challenges pressed hard. And for the native peoples, the presence of a fortified town meant not just a new neighbor, but a shifting world. Missions, trade, alliances, and conflict wove through the daily life of the settlement. As the town matured into a fortress city, it also became a center of colonial power, poised on the edge of empire. The story of St. Augustine is not just of arrival, it is of survival by design, of a settlement transformed into a stronghold. And yet the stronger the walls, the more obvious the fault lines, in culture, in power, in the meaning of settlement.
Cultural crossroads, confluence of peoples.
The settlement of St. Augustine, Florida, did not live on Spanish ambition alone. From its earliest years, the town became a meeting point, sometimes uneasy, sometimes powerful, of multiple peoples. Spanish colonists, native Timucua communities, Africans, both enslaved and free, and later English and Scots, all contributed to a layered society. In 1565, when Pedro Menéndez de Avilés arrived with hundreds of settlers, including around 50 Africans, the dynamic shifted. The native town of Saloy became the site of the Spanish settlement. The Timucua witnessed their land transform. Spanish missions rose, trade networks formed, and alliances were forged and broken. Meanwhile, the African presence, often overlooked, was foundational. From the first recorded African-descended colonists in the late 16th century onward, the settlement held a complexity beyond simple colonizer and colonized. Walls of stone might have defined the fortress town, but human bridges defined daily life. Some Timucua worked with the Spanish as guides, interpreters, and labor. Some resisted. The Africans contributed skills, labor, and culture, often in harsh conditions, but sometimes in free communities like the later Fort Mose.
Legacy in the oldest city's call.
Now we stand on the cobblestone streets of St. Augustine, America's oldest continuously inhabited European established city. Founded in 1565 by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, it predates Jamestown by more than 40 years. Here, the walls of the fortress, the arch in the historic quarter, the mingled architectural styles, they all tell a story of endurance adaptation and change. From its earliest days as a Spanish outpost built on marshland and alliance, St. Augustine evolved through British rule, American statehood, and into the modern era. But this heritage is not a museum piece. It is a living legacy. Indigenous stories remain beneath the streets. Africans and their descendants shaped society here long before other settlements existed.